As I mentioned, I'm Dan Smith. I'm the Gerald Curtis Visiting Associate Professor of Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy. And our speaker this afternoon is Professor Levi McLaughlin from North Carolina State University. He's Associate Professor of Asian Religions in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. He is one of the world's foremost experts in religion and politics in Japan. He is the co-editor of a book which I contributed to. It's a really nice book on Kōmeitō, Religion and Politics in Japan. And he's also the author of a manuscript from 2019 from University of Hawaii Press, Soka Gakkai's Human Revolution, which is soon to be translated into Japanese. He's published widely in several journals and as well as op-eds for a public audience. And when the news came out in July of former Prime Minister Abe's assassination, and then it came out that there was a connection to the Unification Church, I knew that we wanted to get Levi here to help us digest it and also contextualize the Unification Church's relationship to Japanese politics and the broader kind of world of religion and politics in Japan. So without further ado, let's hear from Professor McLaughlin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dan. I'll put this way so I guess it picks up. Appreciate the intro. We don't have a lot of time, so I think I'm just going to dive right in. We are looking here at a press conference held by Japan's Minister of Education, Magaoka Keiko, as she was addressing reporters on the 17th of October, to announce that the government is going to go ahead with an investigation that's aimed at removing religious juridical person status from the organization that used to be called the Unification Church. Japan has a law called the Shukyo Holjinho, which is basically grants an organization preferred tax status amongst other benefits if they register as a religion. It also includes provisions that allow for the government to investigate and dissolve religions. These have never actually been tested. The investigation part is new. We're in untrammeled territory here. Well, what I'm going to do is lay out a timeline, and then I'm going to contextualize some of the most recent developments within the broader framework of this fraught connection between religion and politics in Japan today. So let's go through a few key dates to start with. On the 8th of July, former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, while he was campaigning for his Liberal Democratic Party in the western city of Nara, was gunned down in the streets by the assailant Yamagami Tetsuya. And a few days later, current Prime Minister Kishida has announced plans to hold a state funeral for the former Prime Minister. This is a big deal for numerous reasons. Though Prime Minister Abe was the former Prime Minister, he was indisputably the most powerful politician in Japan, possibly the most powerful politician in post-war Japanese history. Yeah, and there's only been one state-sponsored funeral for a former prime minister since the end of the Pacific War, and that was in 1967 for Yoshida Shigeru. Around this time, revelations were pouring forth in the media surrounding the motivations for Yamagami's murder of Abe, and those had to do with his grudge held against the Unification Church. Yamagami targeted Abe because the Abe and his family had been long-term supporters of this highly controversial organization, and Yamagami's grudge stemmed from the fact that his mother, while she was a member of the church, had been convinced to give ruinous amounts of money to the organization, to the tune of something in the neighborhood of $700,000 that led to the bankruptcy of the family, essentially dissolution of the family. Thereafter, 20 years, he has borne this grudge. Somewhat ironically, it was easier for him to target a former prime minister than it was for him to go after the church leadership. And his particular ire was spurred by an address that Abe had recorded on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 for an event held in Seoul by an organization affiliated with the former Unification Church, in which he praised Park Jae-moon, the current leader. And this was broadcast on YouTube and apparently fomented his decision to create a firearm and murder this prominent politician. There's lots to say about the group called Unification Church. Now it goes under the name the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. It's known for a few prominent reasons. The dedication of its adherents to the true parents, Sang Moon, the founder, who died in 2012, and his widow, Hakta Hanmun. It's probably most famous for its spectacular mass weddings, which are called blessings within the church, in which thousands of couples, mostly people who've never met in person beforehand, are paired up and married in these casts of 1,000 weddings. This is one from 2018 in Seoul. And then also for its excessive demands on its members to provide what has been labeled by its critics spiritual sales. And so there's actually an organization, the National Network of Lawyers Against Spiritual Sales, who are publicizing their statistics about their success in getting money back from the church. Between the years 1987 and 2021, they've recovered 123.7 billion yen. This is in the neighborhood of like 900 million US dollars, right? Which is a fraction of the amount given by adherents in Japan to the organization. The Japanese membership is understood to give something like 80% of the revenue of the church, the global revenue, and much of that actually flows here to the United States. It funds all kinds of conservative causes. They're also known for their support of a wide range of very conservative political objectives, which largely in the Japanese case take shape below the national level at the prefectural and municipal levels. And these include things like promoting anti-LGBT plus ordinances of various kinds, anti-gender equality initiatives of various sorts. And these are basically ways to foment political interest in an area where largely there isn't necessarily much of that activity happening below the national level. They've been active in Japan since about 1959. They claim 600,000 adherents in the country. It's most likely 60,000 plus until recently, and my guess is it's dropped since then due to this massive amount of negative attention now being focused on the organization. On the 27th of September, the state-sponsored funeral for Abe Shinzo was held in Tokyo at the Nippon Budokan. It's a big sports complex. A lot of concerts and other things are held there as well. 4,183 attendees were there. This is lower than the 6,000 or so who were invited. And so this was, there was a lot of controversy, huge amounts of controversies surrounding it, and also in the lead up to it. 7 members of the imperial family did attend. Thousands of current and former Japanese politicians, though many, including many seated Diet members, did not show up. Notably, even though there were 700 or so foreign dignitaries, no G7 leaders. And actually, it was the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who pulled out at the last minute, claiming he had to take care of the aftermath of a hurricane. In the meantime, outside the venue, or nearby the venue, about just over 25,000 people lined up, and they waited for more than 4 hours in some cases, in a line stretching about 2 kilometers, to lay flowers at a designated memorial spot that was separated from this memorial ceremony. This is more than most people expected, more than the reportage leading up to this indicated would line up. And in fact, on Twitter around this time, there was a hashtag that trended silent majority. In other words, there's a significant number of people who didn't, in fact, feel sadness about the murder of the former prime minister, didn't feel that there was a venue for them to express it. Because simultaneously happening on the streets were these protests against the state funeral. And they were happening in front of the National Diet. A few intrepid souls made their way toward the Budokan, and they were blocked. There were about 20,000 police on the streets of Tokyo during this event. It was like an armed camp, essentially. There were also protests being held in front of the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima and a few other prominent sites across the country. Thousands of people. Some of the people online noticed the presence of cosplayers who dressed up like the assassin in a really frankly tasteless display. But what was notable about this was the organizers, largely, many of them at least, had also been involved with organizing protests in 2015 against the security legislation that went through in the fall of that year, which allowed for the reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution to allow for collective self-defense. So one thing you can say about the current Prime Minister, Kishida, he's been really successful in re-sparking the opposition movement in Japan with his decision to run a state funeral. This has been the singularly, one of the major effects is that he's really helped organize the opposition to him and his government. Much of the opposition, though, was across the political spectrum. So this is these are stats that were collated by Tokyo Shimbun, which was a left-wing newspaper. But what notable among these statistics about it noted a shift between July and August into September of public opposition to the plan to hold a state funeral. And it's from different news outlets. The bottom column is most notable. It's from Sankei Shimbun, which is a very right-wing organization, press outlet, staunch Abe supporter for all the years while Abe was Prime Minister. And by the time the funeral was held, 62.3% of its respondents are saying, we don't think it's a good idea for them to have to hold a state funeral for Abe Shinzo. Much of the opposition was articulated in terms of cost. They cited the very high price tag for the funeral. The numbers have varied over recent weeks. They were as high as 11.5 million US. They've come down to about 8 million as the final cost for the event. But for reference, the funeral for Queen Elizabeth was about 9 million US. So this is a lot of money, I guess. But really, the outrage was driven by revelations about links between not just Abe, but his party, the Liberal Democratic Party, and the Unification Church. Outrage against that. And you saw that in some of the protests. So this lady here on her way to protest in front of the Diet is holding a sign that says, if you want to hold a state funeral, why don't you hold it at the Unification Church? So, this is the kind of sentiment. And it's around this time that this is obvious that this connection is dragging down the Kishida cabinet. It's in one poll, the rate was at 29%, with a disapproval rate of about 63%. Not great. All right. So there has been in recent days a strong push to remove religious juridical person status from the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. And so this is actually unfolding by the hour. I've been trying to keep up with this deluge of information surrounding this stuff, so I'm doing my best to hit some highlights here. On the 17th of October, PM Kishida announced that there would be a probe that could strip the church of its Shukyo Hojin status. On the 5th of September, the government had set up a telephone advice service allowing people to phone in with complaints about the organization. There have been over 1,700 calls, something like 70% of them have detailed financial abuse. On the 18th of October, 2 of the opposition parties joined the LDP and Kōmeitō, its coalition partner, to push for a legislative initiative that was actually created by Rikken Minshuto and Ishin to basically say that there's going to be a new law that if there is a manipulative contract you've entered into that demands more than 1/4 of your family's gross income, you can be removed. Someone can take you out of it, basically. And there could be criminal charges that result from this. And importantly, the criminal charge side is really key. So on the 19th of October, Kishida has lowered the bar for a dissolution order to be issued, saying that civil law violations are sufficient, not just criminal law violations, to allow them to remove this religious status from the group. Why is this important? There's no precedent for it. So there's also a lot of nervousness that surrounds it. Earlier, the head of Kōmeitō, which, as I'm going to explain in a minute, is the LDP's coalition partner and is a party founded by the religious organization Soka Gakkai. He expressed some prevarication, the need for prevarication. He expressed some nervousness about this use of a dissolution, saying we need to be extremely cautious about abusing any order to dissolve a religious juridical person. He knows full well this can serve as a precedent, and that Soka Gakkai is probably next, actually. I'm not explaining why that's important. And what's striking, there's a bunch of striking stuff about this. There are 180,000 religious juridical persons in Japan. These range from tiny little temples and shrines to massive organizations. Grand total of 2 have ever been dissolved by the government. The first one was Om Shinrikyo, which committed mass murder, gassing the Tokyo subways in 1995, and also murdering many of its other adherents before that. And the second is a group that's less well known. It's called Myokakuji, the Myokakuji group, which is basically a collection of Buddhist temples based in the Wakayama prefecture. They were committing fraud. And so, but in both cases, they had criminal charges already set up. And so they didn't actually have to carry out an investigation. If you want the details, is Article 78, Clause 2 of the juridical persons law that allows for this investigation to go through. This is being pushed also by the press. There's dramatic press appearances now, particularly they're featuring second-generation former members of Unification Church that are specifically calling for this dissolution, which will allow for them basically to expunge the church from Japan, potentially. That is the idea. Let me talk about the media side of it. Right now, I'm working with a political scientist who's based at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Tokyo. His name is Matthew Brummer. He's also brought in a computer scientist who's based in the Czech Republic, and they're collating and cleaning and analyzing Twitter data. So there's a few things we can say about the social media side of this. One is that reactions to the Abe assassination created the largest ever Twitter event in Japan. It's by far the biggest. Conservatively, but the first 3 months between July 8th and the beginning of September, over 200 million tweets regarding this event. That's a lot. So it's the largest ever Twitter response in Japan, and Japan is the second largest Twitter using nation in the world. So it's actually one of the largest Twitter events, period, right? And so just this is preliminary, but there's a few things we could point to. One is like flagging it for a few key terms, right? Number one is Abe, and number two is Toitsu Kyokai, or Unification Church in Japanese. And the numbers are astonishing. It's just tweets, retweets. There's reasons to believe a lot of this is coming from outside Japan's bots, other stuff to think about as well. But the reaction, the responses, and the effect it's having on other media, for example, broadcast media, morning panel shows, print media, measurable, actually. And so, and this is, for example, is just isolating the term Unification Church, boom. And it's been really relentless. That's the other side of it. It's dipped a little bit, but it's only a little bit. And it's come back in recent days because of these initiatives on the part of the government to carry out these investigations. And so it's not going away. What it brings to mind most of all is the media reaction to the Om attacks in 1995. This is coalesced into the largest watershed moment for religion and politics, period. Which leads, let's look at this, what this means. Why is this such a big deal? Theoretically, a group of 60,000 people or so in Japan shouldn't be that big of a deal, right? It shouldn't be that, and identifying a few politicians, or maybe a lot of politicians' connections to one specific church, maybe that shouldn't necessarily be a surprise, and it should also be something that could be identifiable and amended. Why is it creating such a seemingly disproportionate sense of moral panic? Well, there's a few reasons for that. And that one is the distinctive position of religion in Japan, the category. So that every few years, major media outlets and other polling organizations carry out sort of public opinion polls that include questions about religion. And routinely, Japan ranks among the world's lowest in terms of willingness to self-identify as religious. So, for example, this is an oft-cited example from 2008, the Yomiuri Shimbun, which is Japan's largest newspaper. Actually, it's the newspaper with the largest circulation of any paper in the world. Asked the question, do you have religious faith? And a full 26.1% said yes. It's actually high, comparatively speaking, because those numbers have kind of come down since then. For example, 2010, fewer than 10% of survey respondents in Japan said they trust religious organizations. That's the lowest in the world. It's lower than the People's Republic of China, where it's run by the officially atheist Communist Party. I mean, that's pretty low, right? In 2013, the National Character Survey, 72% have no religious faith, etc. I'm struck by the bottom one here, the 2015 one. the Gallup International Index, where 13% of the respondents said they're religious, it's the second lowest, China's the lowest. 31% said they're not religious, and a full 31% of the respondents said they're atheists. Atheism isn't really a thing in Japan because no theism to speak of, right? But I think given the option, people were going to try to maximally distance themselves from religion, and atheism seemed to be the furthest possible option. And so I think that that's kind of the bias that's happening there. If you ask different kinds of questions, so like, what do you do, more than what do you believe, the numbers shift a bit. The picture becomes more sophisticated. And so you see this in 2020, the NHK Broadcasting Culture Research Institute published the results of its 2018 survey. This is a fascinating thing. First of all, that NHK has this kind of research facility is fascinating on its own, I think. But there's a pretty sophisticated series of questions regarding religious activity. What kinds of rituals do you engage in? What sort of things does your family do, et cetera? And in this case, 47% of the respondents said they believe in either the Buddhas or the Kami, which are the deities within Shinto, which is the religion that's often referred to as sort of a native religion of Japan, though it is also from the continent. Only 32% of people said they have absolutely no belief, which is lower, right? 71% said they performed some kind of ritual visit into their grave, visiting the family grave. And only 12% said they do absolutely nothing religious, right? So it breaks down, nonetheless, really low, and basically an inversion of the United States. It's basically the opposite of the US in terms of these numbers. The US is a very, very religious country. Why is this the case? One, there's a multi-layered series of historical explanations for this, and there's a few you could point to. One is the fact that the actual word for religion is the product of an agonistic political intervention. It's the product of the arrival of the Americans in the middle of the 19th century, forcing essentially the Japanese government in this very tumultuous period to adopt an umbrella category that had not previously existed into legal language that then had to be applied territorially, administratively, and otherwise. And so you see this happening in a few key instances, but one of the big ones is the 1858 Treaty of Amity and Commerce between Japan and the United States, most commonly known as the Harris Treaty, named for Townsend Harris, the emissary from America who forged this. Article 8, in the curious language of the Americans of this era, stipulates that the religion is going to be this sacrosanct category, that there will be, neither side will trample upon the other. It took about a generation for that term to rest in a single stable translation of the word shukyo in Japanese, which gets exported throughout East Asia, throughout Asia generally. It becomes zongjiao in China, for example. So this is how it happens. That which is taken for granted as this sort of seemingly natural category is the product of this very specific political engagement, right? And so I think we're seeing essentially a continuation of that legacy in the present with this current situation. Because it comes from this very explicitly Protestant Christian envoy and the importation of that into a Japanese context, it comes with a lot of baggage. It comes with a lot of presuppositions that go along with what it means to be religious. And those include things like regular worship attendance, that you should be, and also knowledge of teachings and scriptures. You should have something to say about a religion you belong to, right? There's also a heavy emphasis on the centrality of an interiorized faith. You see that in the questions asked by Yomiuri, for example. Do you have religious faith? The fact that that would be the question to ask presumes that this is a kind of an important way to think about it. And a notion of exclusive adherence, like you belong to a religion, not necessarily to a whole bunch of them, right? The big reason, though, people today are very nervous about self-identifying as religious is 1995. And in 1995, when on March the 20th, members of the apocalyptic group Om Shinrikyo, 6 members boarded the Tokyo subways in the morning rush hour, carrying bags of sarin gas. They had manufactured in a secret compound on the flanks of Mount Fuji, and with sharpened umbrellas, popped these bags and left them on the train in the hopes of essentially killing thousands and bringing down the government, because all the trains they boarded were scheduled to meet under the station Kasumigaseki, which is where the National Diet is, right? That didn't happen. These trains full of poison gas don't keep running. and this, of course, was a rather unrealistic plan, put it mildly. Nonetheless, it is one that absolutely devastated the image of religion in Japan for a generation. And so thereafter, the cognitive link between saying I am religious and violence and social marginality and general scariness was so complete that even the average Buddhist priest making her or his way to perform a memorial at a family home, for example, felt nervous wearing their vestments in public because of this nervousness about the category of religion in general. In 2011, when there were the mass disasters in Northeast Japan, there was kind of a counter narrative that built up to a certain extent, kind of a minority story, that religion isn't just a scary thing, but it's also a positive contributor to national reconstruction, that we see priests and others who are associated with religious groups contributing to aid of various sorts. So that was made as a possible option. Now we're back, thanks to the Abe assassination, we're back to this situation here. So what we're seeing right now is an unfolding very rapidly of the curation of the idea of what counts as real religion and that which counts as cult, that which counts as assuredly Japanese and that which is not, being very meticulously choreographed by a series of well-positioned people, actually. And they're creating a hardened divide between the cult versus tradition group. And it's right now specifically advancing via deliberations that are being overseen by the Religious Juridical Persons Law Council. This is a group within the Agency for Cultural Affairs, which is under the umbrella of the Ministry of Education. And right now, the chair of this newly appointed group is Ishii Kenji, and he's the professor of Shinto studies at Gakkai University, a very prominent academic. He's also he's a data scientist of sorts. He's been instrumental in creating very meticulous statistics about religious identity and belonging and activity in Japan for decades, and he's overseen the training of Shinto priests. So these are not innocent things. These are part of this creates a very specific political image of what counts as properly as religion. At the same time, there's a moral panic that we see in that, for example, that massive Twitter surge and related media about cults that's being amplified by anti-cult activists, including many who were active actually after the Om Shinrikyo attacks in '95. And so in some cases, these are folks who are themselves former members of the Unification Church, those who are associated with the Japanese Communist Party, and a few others on the left who have been laboring for decades, trying to bring attention to spiritual sales, to the exploitation of members, to those who have ventured into, for example, the mass weddings and been forced to move to Korea, and a few other examples like that. Now they're in the spotlight, and they're in the spotlight every single day. And this is really shifting the discourse. There is now concern for ways moral panic can be weaponized by savvy political actors. And we're seeing this in the silences and in the statements being made by Japan's ruling coalition. Whenever I talk about them, I love showing this photo because of the poetry on the faces of the two leaders here. We have former Prime Minister Abe shaking the hands of the leader of Kōmeitō, Yamaguchi Natsuo. The love that is shared by these two partners is palpable. Let's give a brief overview. Japan's at the national level is the government comprises two parties. There's the LDP, which has been the major party in Japan with a few breaks since 1955, currently led by Kishida Fumio. And there's also Kōmeitō, who is led by Yamaguchi Natsuo, who's just entered into his 8th term as party leader, somewhat to the surprise of others that he's staying on. As you can see, a very small number of members in the lower and upper houses. That is not the end of the story. Electioneering on behalf of Japan, of the Kōmeitō and its affiliated lay Buddhist association, Soka Gakkai, ensures the election of many LDP members. And were it not for the vote gathering on the part of Soka Gakkai, Japan's politics would be very, very different indeed. So on the one hand, you have the Kōmeitō, which is very obviously comes from a religious base, though there is an official administrative division between the religion and the party. And on the other hand, you have the LDP, which includes a wide range of its supporters who come from For example, the Association of Shinto Shrines, a group called Nippon Kaigi, which I'll explain briefly in a minute, the Unification Church, and numerous others who are quite different from one another, doctrinally in terms of practice, in terms of institutions, but will agree to cooperate on shared utopian and pragmatic objectives. Briefly, Kōmeitō, sometimes glossed as a clean government party. It's a pivotal presence. It was founded in 1964. It's been in coalition with the LDP since 1999. Importantly, one of the major reasons it entered into coalition was to protect it from animosity directed against it after the Aum Shinrikyo attacks. So I think we're actually going to see maybe an inversion of that happening now. So there's lots of reasons to think that these incidents have a huge impact on coalition politics. It has members in both houses of the Diet and of course in prefectural municipal assemblies. These are mostly single-digit percentages, but like I said, that ain't the end of the story because they're of their capacity to ensure the election of their LDP ally candidates. It's driven for the most part by grassroots level members, mostly in its women's division. And to be a member of Soka Gakkai is to engage in electioneering. And the most powerful vote gathering group is the women's division within Soka Gakkai, who engaged in this practice called F-tori, or friend getting votes from outside Soka Gakkai. On the other hand, you have Nippon Kaigi, which is the Japan conference. There's a lot of ink spilled about this organization in recent years. It was kind of a glut of publications around it about 5 years ago. It's basically a meeting point for a diverse range of activists. It claims about 38,000 members. This is not a large number, right? Japan has just shy of 127 million people. So this is a very modest number. It was founded in 1997 by an avant-garde composer named Mayuzumi Toshiro, whose music is amazing, by the way. I highly recommend checking it out. It's great. He successfully brokered the merger of two pre-existing lobby organizations. One is called Nippon o Mamoru Kokumin Kaigi, which is largely political activists, and then Nippon o Mamoru Kai, hard to say that quick, which is largely religious groups. What brought those religious groups together was their mutual hatred of Soka Gakkai. The ironies are extraordinary within this coalition, right? It's basically a meeting point for most, the signatories are most of the LDP Diet politicians. There's lots of business leaders, journalists, educators, religious groups, ethics training organizations, other ideologically motivated enterprises. The leaders of Nippon Kaigi itself are largely from a conservative religious organization, not conservative, but initially conservative religious group called Seicho no Ie. Someone needs to write a book on Seicho no Ie. This is an amazing, really interesting religious organization. And essentially, they were reacting against the student movement of the 60s and 70s. The leftists created the right in Japan to a large extent. And so this is kind of like a product of a backlash against largely socialist and Marxist activism of that period. It's basically it's a very modest power operation with deep ties to power holders. I've been able to spend time with their leadership, interview them, and go to their headquarters. It is tiny. It makes the Weatherhead offices look palatial. It's really striking in that regard. They conflate pragmatic and transcendent aims, and you can see that to a certain extent in their slogan, which is on this is a splash page for their homepage, toward making a nation with pride. Hokori aru kuni zukuri e. And this notion of nation making, I think, is absolutely key. It's so cultivation, the cultivation of the person, through that, the cultivation of the nation is a kind of a binding agent. It brings together all kinds of participants who come from the Association of Shinto Shrines and its affiliate organization, the Shinto Association of Spiritual Leadership, which is the Diet, which is a Diet member connection for the group. There are formal and informal associations of Shinto clergy. There's ethics training groups, which have thousands and thousands of participants. There are lots of NGOs, NPOs, largely especially in overseas and domestic development initiatives, and lots of religious juridical persons. They're Buddhist, they're Christian, they're Shinto, there are many others. They're diverse. They will talk smack about one another to me when I talk to them because they don't like one another. They often compete to have the same people join their groups and stuff like that. But they have a shared commitment to its political and transcendent aims. Unification Church fits into this to a certain extent. All right, this is the environment into which the church has made a place for itself, right? So it's not unusual it's not exceptional, right? It's part of this much more complex ecology. They generally agree on shared forms of cultivation as a means to achieve them, and they engage in techniques of making the person hitozukuri to realize this goal of kumizukuri. I'm going to end here though, because there's questions with lots of other details we can bring up. I'm going to start, maybe just end with the question that I'm wrestling with too. There's a lot of attention on the LDP politicians and their connections to the church. There's a lot of attention on the leadership of the church and its various exploits throughout the decades, in Japan especially. But who's missing from the story? Well, we could actually think about it in terms of other politicians who have yet to be fully investigated. Just in the last day or so, there have been these exposés in Asahi and now in Yomiuri in Japan about the signatories to pledges that were put forward by the church that have been signed by politicians, which defies what the LDP is telling us about itself. There was an internal investigation conducted after much pressure, and on 12th of September, the LDP Secretary General Motegi announced that 179 of 379 Diet members had these links, but there are lots of others, it turns out. That's, to me, less interesting, actually. I'm more interested in who's not part of this story yet. And I'm particularly notable is an absence of sufficient attention to gender and sufficient attention to social class. These are aspects that have basically erased the protagonists from the story. I'd like to hear less about Yamagami and more about Yamagami's mother, for example, to really understand how do we account for the growth and vibrancy of the organizations like this within Japan, right? It took the murder of Japan's most prominent man by a male assailant to trigger public outcry against decades of women adherent exploitation. We've known these details. They've been available to us. There have been lots of attempts to bring them into public prominence. Didn't work, and it took this murder for that to happen. So I think we need to account for the grassroots level everyday engagements of adherents like Yamagami's mother to understand how Japan's religion politics nexus is mobilized from the ground up. And while institutional leadership and representations of claimants are male dominated, local level participation in meetings, rituals, electioneering, related events, this is driven by women whose institutional engagement exceeds a calculus of exploitation. So if we're going to exclusively focus on monetary exploitation and various other forms, we won't really understand how is it then that people become involved and what do they gain from this? What is their subjectivity and how do we understand it? So we're unable to properly understand motivations for participation in this ecology without sustained efforts to appreciate non-elite participants on their own terms. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor McLaughlin. We have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. And I ask that if you have a question, please identify yourself, tell us who you are, and then keep your questions brief and with a question mark at the end, rather than a statement. Is there anybody who has a question for our speaker? Yeah.
My name is Gerald, and I'm not a student at the university, but I was interested in this subject very much, so I asked somebody else too. So my question is this: I was expecting a very different type of presentation, but it was very interesting. But my question suddenly occurred to me: what constitutes left wing, right wing in Japan? Because according to the conservative newspaper and all that stuff, are they conservative right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, his family from his grandfather's day are for getting the Unification Church into Japan.
Sure.
Under auspices of, I was told, by the CIA. That means, like, what? Wait a minute.
Well, that's not left wing, is it?
What are they considered as right wing when his association is more like left wing, which is basically US thinking?
No, I wouldn't say that.
So
Much of the attention that also seems seemingly the motivation for the assassin has been focused on the Abe's family sustained connections to the Unification Church, going back to his grandfather Kishi Nobusuke. So there was clearly at least a friendship or like a strong camaraderie that was forged between Sangyeong-moon and Kishi. What were major reasons for that? It seems like one of the binding reasons was their shared animosity to communism. And so one of the organizations that was founded in 1968 by the Unification Church was the Association for Victory Over Communism, right? And that at the time was a galvanizing force, and it brought together lots of different actors in Asia, in fact. And it's the legacy of that is visible today. To say you're virulently against communism in Japan in 2022 seems a little quaint, to be perfectly honest. It doesn't really galvanize much political mobilization. So what's developed in lieu of that over recent decades is a focus on social conservatism. And so you saw a move away from this really explicit engagement with anti-communist causes to focus on family education. And especially you saw this after 2006 with there was a renewed laws regarding the education in Japan that allowed for basically a focus on morality education in the schools. And that was seen as an opportunity for a lot of religious organizations across the board to actually enter into the public sphere in a new way. And that's really where you see this focus on the part of Nippon Kaigi affiliates, and thereafter, actually, of Unification Church. They're kind of latecomers to that when it comes to, for example, their efforts at the subnational level to encourage politicians to sign on to various pledges regarding the importance of promoting family education. We should know as a euphemism for very sort of anti-gay, anti-feminist activities, right? And so that seems to have been generally the shift. There's more to it than that, but I would hardly say that the affiliation is left-wing.
Yes.
Mark Seldin, I've been editing the Asia Pacific Journal forever. At the very end, you open up a series of things. I think they're the basis for Columbia inviting you to give your next talk here. But that is women and feminism and their role in this. They're just at the edge of your story, but they're absolutely central.
Yes.
Could you dive a bit deeper and
Sure.
how do we understand this very important role of women in the church, in the politics of electing the LDP and other politicians,
Okay.
etc.
There's a lot to say. So we can start with the importance of gender in the church itself. The leadership is, curiously, the leader of the Unification Church is a woman, and given the general politics of the organization, this is a bit surprising. This has everything to do with succession and essentially a failure to secure a male heir after the death of Sangyeong-moon. So Hak Ja-han-moon is now the leader, and I think they're actually experiencing a crisis of the next generation. In terms of regular daily activity at the church level in local communities, overwhelmingly it is women who are organizing and taking part. Not exclusively, of course, but this is the majority.
Financing too.
Well, this is the thing, right? So who is being convinced to basically give unmanageable amounts of money in exchange for spiritual services? Again, not exclusively women, but overwhelmingly so. And also the other aspect of this is the specific nature of the doctrine that has taken shape in a Japanese context, essentially who owes whom what, that there is essentially a debt owed by Japan to the Korean church. And so one of the ways in which this plays out is encouraging women to enter into marriages that are organized by the church. And one of the, for example, there has been longstanding research on this. One of the more prominent researchers in the Japan field is at the University of Hokkaido, Sakura Yoshihide, has published on this stuff for decades. And one of the things he did was he actually looked at the demographics of specific provinces in Korea to look at their shifts and the numbers after these mass weddings, and they're noticeable. And it's like, because women have moved from Japan to these places, significant for the anti-cult activists, because this is how they can track people down who have lost touch with their families. And so there's been essentially one of the accusations from former members is this is a form of human trafficking. And this is actually the strong accusation that's being placed against it. It's another possibility for the criminal charge that they might need to proceed with dissolution of the religious juridical person's side. On a more basic level, though, prior to the pandemic, I was able to spend a lot more time in Japan. And one of the things I was able to do is spend significant amounts of time with signatories to the Nippon Kaigi, with ethics training groups and others in their regular activities in local levels, overwhelmingly women. So one conclusion you might draw, which is surprising to some, is that women are driving nationalism in Japan. The face of nationalist organizations is overwhelmingly male, and the image, the sort of the ideological thrust of it is overwhelmingly male. Nonetheless, at a day-to-day level, women are powering this engine. This is also the case with vote gathering for Soka Gakkai, through Soka Gakkai for Kōmeitō and its electoral allies. And so if we don't pay attention to gender, we don't understand any of it.
So much of this is counterintuitive
Yeah,
and very
perhaps.
persuasive.
Can I ask, so clearly most more than anybody else about the role of Soka Gakkai in influencing Japanese politics, and we've talked about the Unification Church, but both Soka Gakkai and Unification Church have adherents and movements in other countries as well, including the United States.
Mhm.
Are there efforts to influence or connect with politicians or policy outside of Japan, including in the United States?
The Unification Church is famous for this, right?
Right.
And
can
so,
you- yeah,
I
tell
mean,
us about
there's lots of there have been decades of exposés on this, to be honest, regarding most, especially the Republican Party and connections to the Unification Church. Going back to Nixon, for example, there were prayers conducted by members of the church on the White House lawn while Nixon was, possibly going to be up on charges. He personally thanked the church. Reagan said that the Washington Times is the first paper he reads every day. The Washington Times is a newspaper that was founded by the Unification Church, funded seemingly with money from Japan, from members actually. And so and there's lots of other business interests and lots of other things happening as well. Soka Gakkai is more of a conundrum in this regard, because there are many difficulties in establishing equivalents to Kōmeitō outside of Japan that have to do with how the religion will be perceived, but also has to do with the internal doctrinal aspects of the religion as well. How can we justify this? And so the foundation of Kōmeitō was based in a very specific interpretation of a 13th century Buddhist lineage. And it had to do with the getting governmental support to create a temple facility that would mark the conversion of the populace to singular embrace of the Lotus Sutra. Exporting that to, say, the United States, difficult. But there are, I guess, latter-day explanations how you might do that. And I've heard Gakkai members in the States complain about this. They say, we want to do something similar that's political, but we're not able to, or there's no institutional sort of framework for this kind of thing. And that's true for the estimated 191 other countries in which Soka Gakkai has members across the globe. So, yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Cadena, and I'm an associate for IEAS. I'm up from down here.
Thanks,
I
Amy.
really enjoyed this talk. I have a lot of questions, but let me ask two questions. So I'm really interested in, as a political scientist, I'm interested in how much influence this group has over these politicians.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm also interested in how much relative to the other religious organization. I know there's many religious organizations. So how much influence, how can we kind of get a sense of how much influence that? I know
That's the big question.
Support.
Yeah.
But the other groups is there something about the campaign support that gets the input that other groups don't provide? That's one question. And then the second question, I was really interested in one of the comments you made at the end about how after 1995, Soka Gakkai was like, oh, we're going to be on our best behavior now, kind of after this religious.
There's more to that story, but I could get it if you want. Yeah.
Right now, we're going to observe religious organizations giving a lot of support to the government. So they kind of think, well, some of this unhappiness toward them coming from the public.
Let me start with that and get to the very important first question. Can you imagine being a religiously affiliated campaigner right now, going out there trying to gather votes in any capacity, or even trying to engage in some kind of lobbying? I think that there would be such a feeling of animosity toward that right now that it's difficult to imagine people being motivated to do that, right? So I do think that there's going to be more quiet means or sort of measures taken by groups to try to ensure that they're protected or hope they're protected. Because I really, yeah, I think that what a lot of people would perceive is that this is possibly going to set a very dangerous precedent for religious organizations, right? It is unprecedented. But there's a thing to point out some key aspects of this. The two religious juridical persons that were dissolved previously had criminal charges placed against them. So when it came to the need to investigate, they didn't have to do it because the court, that we have these court proceedings. We can dispense with whatever the law requires us to do because it's already been done, and we can proceed with dissolving them. We don't have that with the Unification Church. Instead, what we have are potential civil code violations that could be used. That itself is a potentially dangerous precedent. How many civil code violations might there be with other groups, right? What does that mean, right? Does it mean if you're sued for defamation, if you're sued for a violation of a contract, or who knows what else, right? This could be a really big deal for a lot of organizations, and they're very justifiably nervous. How they're going to react, they're probably going to go through the Shmuin, that organization that's part of the Agency for Cultural Affairs, other things like that. But to get to the very knotty question of like, how much influence can we actually measure? That's something that I'm working with other people on this as well. Frankly, there's a fair amount of skepticism about it. So one person, for example, I think she's a fabulous researcher whom everyone should read, is Tomomi Yamaguchi, she's an anthropologist, she's at Montana State University. One of very few people who's had a sustained engagement with members of the Unification Church below the national level, doing really important field work with anti-feminist campaigns. She herself is, I am a feminist. She goes out there, explains this to folks. So it's an amazing interaction. So she was saying, like, what can we, how much can we, there's a few things to be skeptical about. One is the kind of Johnny-come-lately aspect of the Unification Church to some of these causes. They were already being promoted by Nippon Kaigi and its various affiliates. And somewhat cynically, I do think to myself, like, just how much how much help do LGBT politicians need being misogynist and homophobic, right? I think most of them are pretty much along that track themselves, and they don't necessarily disagree with those ideas. They don't need much of a nudge to go along with it. What's notable, though, is below the national level. That's where you can really track stuff. That's where you can really measure how interventions made by the Unification Church have, in fact, created new situations at the prefectural and municipal levels. So there are these ordinances that were put forward to combat what were perceived by these groups as the dangers of gender equality, the dangers of, for example, legally acknowledging same-sex marriage. So one of the aspects of that is the Shibuya ward in Tokyo. This is where the headquarters of the Unification Church is for Japan, where they have their church right next to the residence of Kishi. Actually, the Abe family's residence are right next door, and that's where that's the ward that has offered I guess a non-binding legal acknowledgement of same-sex marriages, right? Which has some effects on the lives of those who would receive this, because it's essentially in their own backyard. The church has responded to that unsuccessfully, but nonetheless, there are other examples along those lines that point to the fact that, yeah, that's measurable. But when it comes to, for example, vote moving, there's a few cases, but I have to say, having spent a lot of years focusing on Soka, Gakkai, and Kōmeitō, their numbers look pretty modest. I mean, the understood average at the national level in each national district where Soka Gakkai mobilizes votes is 20,000 votes, right, per district. And so the church has 60,000 people. It's just not going to match that, right? There's a few cases where it does it, and that seems to have been the difference. And Dan will talk about this too, that the margins in many cases are very, very narrow, and so this can have a significant effect. But there are lots of other groups that do this too, right? So I think it's the combo. It's the combo of the really outrageous extent of the exploitation by the group of its adherents, with these other aspects we have to think about.
Yeah, might say a little bit more about interreligious competition within Buddhist groups and Christian groups that I wonder.
Yeah.
And also one thing that really puzzles me is usually in most countries under most circumstances, when there was an assassination event, public opinion decidedly shifts against the assassin
Right.
and whatever caused the assassin's avoiding.
Yes.
This is really puzzling. And aside from the pre-existing bias against religion,
Yes.
is there anything else that helps us have that strength?
You know, this has been, a lot of people have been noticing this. I've done a lot of, I don't usually talk to reporters. I'm not that important, but I've got a lot of calls over the last couple months, right? And in almost every case, the reporters I've spoken to have said, this is the most successful assassination we've ever covered. He got exactly what he set out to get. And it's really jarring. And there's a noticeable effort to apotheosize Yamagami, right? To essentially raise him above the level of the ordinary human. There's also attempts to do that to Abe amongst the conservative circles in the LDP. He was made an eternal advisor for one conservative group within the LDP, and they have his photo and everything. So it's deification of a sort, right? But nothing compared to the online. It's mostly driven by Reddit, by the way. If you're interested in finding some really horrific, I find really tasteless examples of essentially idolizing. There's a group of young women who think he's cute and have their own group and everything like that. And hey, man, you know, that's notable, right? What else is going along with that? Abe was very powerful, but not popular. So one of the aspects that Matthew Brummer and others who were part of that project are trying to sift out of that Twitter response is sentiment. And so what's really noticeable is this very little sadness, right? And there was initially a great outrage against Yamagami and all kinds of accusations against him. And then around September the 1st, it seems to have shifted to favorable impressions of him. And so he seems to become kind of like a folk hero. For what it's worth, by the way, within Japan, there is a strong history of this that goes back centuries of that scrappy resistor to oppressive political authority who sacrifices himself, probably loses his life, and then gets apotheosized. And in fact, quite literally deified, becomes a kami who can become an object of worship within a local shrine, that kind of thing. Not exclusive to Japan either, right? So yeah. So in terms of competition religiously, I mean, yes, these are organizations that need to have adherence. There is Japan is distinct and not distinct, but it's like one of many countries in which multiple affiliation is the norm. And so there are groups that are exceptions to that. Soka Gakkai is one group, but you do not belong to other organizations if you're a member of Soka Gakkai. The Unification Church would be also like that. You are a member of the Unification Church. By and large, though, most people in Japan follow I'm born Shinto, marry Christian, die Buddhist. And that is a kind of an aphorism that's used. Christian weddings are very popular, even though only about 1% of the population is probably Christian because they're beautiful. But I would think about competition more broadly. So for example, someone I know, she grew up in a family of barbers, and they have a barber shop in a city in Hokkaido in the north. And it's a very working class neighborhood. And they subscribed to 2 newspapers. They had Seikyo Shinbun, which is the Soka Gakkai newspaper, and Shinbun Akahata, which is the Communist Party newspaper, because the people who came to get their haircut were either members of the Communist Party or members of Soka Gakkai. I think if you put the papers together, they would spontaneously combust. You know, it's like, that's how opposed they are to one another. But it should tell you that there is a strong kind of a shared competition over a shared pool of people. That's an aspect of all.
We've actually gone a little bit over time, but thank you so much to our speaker, Professor Levi McLaughlin, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon and stuck around to the very end. So much to chew on, and I do hope that we can get you back with your next book about gender and social class and this sort of unappreciated dimension of all this stuff. That's sort of a nudge to write that book. Yeah, it's a great puzzle. So let's give a round of applause to Professor.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it.